The purpose of this study, the reason you all funded it as American taxpayers, was to see what happened to people who went off their meds. So in this study, everybody was treated conventionally with drugs, okay? And then they're just followed for 15 years. And he ends up with 64 schizophrenia patients. 25 are off, and the remaining part remain on drugs, 39. Well, what does he report? He reports the outcomes, and it's a naturalistic study. Everybody treated with drugs, and then he just follows them. People are free to go off, etc. And basically, as I said, 25 to 64 go off, and he follows them at 2, 4.5, 7.5, 10, and 15 years. What does he find? First of all, he finds that of those off medication, more than half work. Okay? More than half, well, 40% of them become asymptomatic. They end up recovered, working, etc. The percentage that, so the recovery rate for those off medication, and recovery included working half time, was 40%. The percentage on medication was 5%. Okay? And all his things, on all his different outcome measures, there's a lot of outcome measures. The off medication group does markedly better in every single measurement. Okay? In his milder psychotic disorders group, it's the same thing. Okay? It's those who get off do much, much better. And the other thing here is this. So many of them are just not psychotic, okay? The symptoms pass, they go back to work, etc. How many of you have heard of that study? Did you read about it in the New York Times? No. You read about it in any magazine? Okay, why not?
Suppressed. It's suppressed. To make a long story short, using intellectual jargon, white people and their Zionist allies are allowed to say that you're inferior and that the government should eradicate you. But if I was to flat out say that white people are inferior, they would say it was hate speech and that I'm a racist. Now couple that with the idea that if there's something that is socially normative that is agreed upon by the masses when it comes to race, one of the main things, if anything you could say, is that white people are crazy. How many times we say, oh, those crazy white people, they like to skydive, they like to do this crazy white person stuff, this rock and roll. They're crazy. Our stuff is cultural, their stuff is crazy. Okay? So the idea that the group of people, the race that we consider the craziest, is going to judge you and your behavior by itself is enough to make one want to execute them. A completely sane man want to execute them. And the knowledge of the verifiable eugenics program that is being executed every single moment of every day in the world by the most out of touch and what we subjectively and perhaps objectively, look at as crazy people, makes you want to go even further than that. Now, let me play you some clips that are going to really strike home. You're going to really be forced to really think about things and really ask yourself, am I wrong, first of all? And if you do not come to the conclusion that I'm wrong, I want you to truly look inside your soul and ask yourself, well, why did it take a white person telling you these things before you believed them? When I have been saying this for years and years, especially you New World Order guys listening, you secret societies, you police officer guys, all the trolls that watch my videos, I want you to ask yourself, well, why did it take a white guy saying it for you to believe it? But when I say it, you say that I'm crazy and I'm paranoid. This first clip I'm going to play you is about children that are inferior. Now, I want you to notice that they're going to bring up physically inferior. So who's more physically superior than the top martial artists? When it comes to mind, what races are inferior? White people, even though they're the majority of the people, do not dominate the sports that all people participate in, such as basketball, football, etc. Why is that? Yet they have the nerve to do eugenics on people based on the idea that the most privileged class supposedly is mentally superior, physically superior, spiritually superior. I mean, it's utter nonsense. And it is the left mostly doing it. But the right is not shedding any tears. Politics is a bunch of people on the left who are eugenicists. Homosexuals and feminists in the intellectual community are eugenicists. Everyone else is kind of like a dumbass who just follows the leader. On the right side, you have a bunch of racists who want to get rid of black people, but they don't want eugenics used on white people as well. That's why a lot of them are poor, ignorant, inbred, Christian white people. Not all white people who are Christian are ignorant and inbred, but a lot of the Republicans are. So that's their beef with one of the major beefs with the left that's kind of unspoken for the most part, is that they don't want eugenics done on them. They just want it done on the Negras.
Not the poor, etc. But if these compatriots continue to procreate children inferior in moral, intellectual, and physical qualities, it is easy to believe that the time may come when such persons would be considered as enemies to the state and to have forfeited all claims to kindness.
That was Francis Galton, okay? Gang stalking, government harassment is about going after the people that eugenicists have deemed inferior and undesirable. They are enemies of the state because of what he just said. It says you should be kind to them as long as they do what you want them to do, and they don't reproduce. They don't reproduce, their progeny, their offspring, sexually, and they don't reproduce their ideas. As long as they're not spreading their ideas, or other people are applying their ideas, that's a form of reproduction. Spreading, multiplying the ideas. Be fruitful and multiply. Multiply the people who see it your way. As long as people aren't reproducing what Chukwuemeka has said and he doesn't have sex with anyone, be kind to him. But the moment he tries to spread his beliefs or has children, be very harsh to him. That was what Galton said. A rich white person who coined the term eugenics and is known as the father of eugenics. Now let's go to 1018. The Eugenics Psychiatry /DVD uploaded by Fan Smiles. Very informative. It proves my point to a T. I just don't present it the way they do. I thoroughly present each fact and explore it. That's why there's so many videos. He just kind of gives you the facts and then gives his little 2 cents and keeps moving. I thoroughly explore it. And there's still people who don't get it when I thoroughly explore it. Let's go to 1018. This is about Virginia Woodhull, and she's a feminist. And keep in mind, she is a feminist. There's an alliance between gays, feminists, and mental health. I've been saying this for years. Keep in mind.
So it is picked up, and in the first sort of eugenic tract you see published in the United States is published in 1891.
1891, the first sort of eugenics tract is what he said, right? Now listen very carefully. Who published it? Who published it? Who was the first one to publish it? What kind of person were they? And why does it make sense that they're that type of person?
By a feminist, an American feminist named Virginia Woodhull. She publishes a book called The Rapid Multiplication of the Unfit.
Well, wait a second. Aren't feminists talking about pro-choice? So yes, we want you to have a choice whether or not to abort your baby, whether or not to be sterilized, because you have sovereignty over your body. And we want you to choose not to have a kid, unless, of course, you're one of these rich people who can afford it. And because we believe the rich are genetically superior. Not that they're privileged scum, or that they have white privilege, or that white society helps them out, but because they are superior.
Rights. The best minds of the day agree that, quote, imbeciles, criminals, paupers, and the otherwise unfit must not be bred. For that to occur, she notes, the unfit have to be prohibited from marrying, segregated into asylums, and forcibly sterilized.
Segregated into asylums and forcibly sterilized. Well, Mecca, aren't some of the side effects of these prescription medications, you know, the psychiatric medications, keeping people from reproducing, which is kind of like forcibly sterilizing someone when you force medicate them. Well, absolutely. And that is what I've been saying for years.
As early as 1891, she's setting out a social agenda for sort of preventing the unfit from breeding.
From what? From sort of preventing the unfit, quote unquote, from breeding. You know, by stigmatizing them with a mental disorder and teaching people that mental disorders are biological, not a result of the white people who cause the environment, who are the underlying cause for this harmful Babylonian environment, but it's biological. You know, it's your fault that you're oppressed. Just like that University of Missouri guy said. Remember, these people are scientific racists, social Darwinists. They believe that it is your fault, not their fault. That the major ills in society are a result of the people. Disproportionately the people's fault, not the system. So even if you have a system of Nazi Germany, you know, the soldiers who killed the Jews, it's not the officers' fault. It's not the people who made the system, who gave the orders. It is the people. Now, I'm not saying that the people don't play a role, but they play a very small role. Those of us who are sociologists and who look at things from the most true perspective, the sociological perspective, comparative psychology, if you might say, comparative perspective. We're looking at how does this compare to what everyone else is doing? How does this compare to other systems and so on and so forth? It is painfully obvious that this society is controlled by eugenicists, and they are the biggest hypocrites of all because their respective ethnicities, and I won't explore what they are the most privileged, the physically weakest, and the most inferior. And almost every time they win a competition, they almost always use drugs to do it.
Now, what will then happen is eugenics will begin to take hold and be accepted as a legitimate science. Over the next 20.
So notice this is going on for a long time. This goes back to 1883 with Galton and so on. And then it goes on right into the 1900s. You know, Margaret Sanger, so on, Virginia Woodhull. And now he's about to talk about Carnegie and Davenport. So some say, well, this happened like Rockefeller is still the honorary head of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. There's still a Rockefeller Center. Rockefeller still funds things. He's still super rich. His family is very, very relevant. You think that the same people who were around when eugenics was cracking before World War II, you know, when eugenics was on record, and after that with this forced sterilizations all over this country, you know, the same people, not only their same family, he was alive. This was what he believed then. This is what he believes now. And this is his agenda. It always was the Rockefeller Carnegie Foundation agenda to do eugenics on society and to use psychiatry and government institutions to do it. Not to mention political groups, hate groups, and secret societies, but we won't get into that because you pussies can't wrap your little heads around it. Fucking bitches.
30 years, and we'll see how it happens that it becomes accepted as a science. The first step, and by the way, the funding for the development of this science comes from the industrial titans of America at the time. It comes from Andrew Carnegie. It comes from John D. Rockefeller Jr., and in particular it also comes from Mary Harriman, who's the widow of a railroad magnate, Edward Harriman.
Oh, very interesting. Transportation. You know, we kind of got airports now. And there's still railroads. There's still Caltrain and so on. All these transportation guys, these telecommunication guys, these petrochemical big pharmaceutical fucks, and the Fabian fucking fruitcakes that are aligned to them. The left-right paradigm. And you just don't get it, okay? You don't get it, I get it, okay? If you don't get it, just shut up, stay out of politics. You're a coward if you fucking do get it and you're helping them. You're a bitch. You're a coward.
So the founding moment is 1904. Andrew Carnegie provides funds to a man named Charles Davenport to establish in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, quote, the name of the group is going to be the Center for the Study of Human Evolution. And again, it's to be a eugenics.
Oh, kind of like the Human Genome Project. You know, it's the study of human evolution. How touching. You see how they start making these seemingly harmless names? These clandestine dogs.
Center. Now, who is Charles Davenport?
He's a bitch!
He is of WASP heritage. He's Harvard educated.
Oh, let's not forget the link between Masonry and Protestants, and most white people, most people in America at the time, most American citizens, were WASPs. White, Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Now, remember, it's 1904, and he would like to boast that his people have been in America for 300 years. I'm not sure how they've been here for 300 years, but that's what he would boast. So what is the first thing that Charles Davenport begins to say? Well, he begins to say that human traits are passed down in the same way that eye color is.
Well,
so
unfortunately, I'm almost out of time here. If you don't understand one of the first publications, if not the first, was done by a feminist, and she was speaking just as bitterly, and Margaret Sanger was a feminist as well. You know, if you don't understand the link between racism, atheism, feminism, Satanism, the worst criminals, and eugenics. Oh, excuse me, also the LGBT community. You know, I don't know what to tell you. I'm out of time. Thank you. There is just overwhelming research that society is run by eugenicists. I have never been as satisfied of any truth, perhaps, in my entire life than of this. That eugenicists run the world, and the left and the right, and the Jew versus the white, and the secret society structures, etc., are all about eugenics. What does science show us about who is the master race? This is the questions they attempt to answer with fabrications and lies. Now, so let us go back to the documentary or the video.
Hospital, I think, here in Brooklyn, New Yorkers, etc., to do a study of the insane. And it's Aaron Rosenhoff that indeed finally concludes that there's an insane gene and a normal gene. And the way he does this is this science. He looks at 72 hospitalized patients, and he looks at the offspring of 1,097 relatives of these 72 hospitalized patients. Now, initially, he finds that only about, I think it's like, it's just a small number seem to be insane, and it doesn't fit his story about a simple Mendelian gene. So what does he do? He goes and looks at these relatives, and he starts saying, well, you're a little bit agitated. You count as mentally ill. And he just expands the boundaries. You've been sad. You're mentally ill. Until he gets a number of the 1,097, he concludes that 351 are mentally ill. It's right on the number if you believe in Mendelian genetics. So he comes out. He says this. Now, this gets published in textbooks.
Now that gets published
Discussion
in
of this,
textbooks. So this is how they have done it, and they have been caught as recently as this year fabricating stories. Yeah, that too. Fabricating clinical tests. Okay. Now pay attention. Pay attention to this whole video. All these clips I'm putting in one video. I know it's long, but I really have to go through the key points, and I have to elaborate on them for you to grasp what is going on here.
It was talked about in certain corners. As early as 1911, Charles Davenport, remember he's the Harvard-educated person who was the first given funds to establish the eugenics office in Cold Spring Harbor. He wrote this in a book. He says that if a society has to choose between allowing the unfit to procreate or killing them, the latter is the preferable option. So here at this scientific thing, they're saying this is a...
Okay, so it's important to note 1927 Buck versus Bell Supreme Court case. They found 8-1 that it is constitutional to forcibly sterilize people. The system has always been involved in this. Okay, this is about eugenics and population control, meaning getting rid of the undesirables and, you know, keeping the people that the people in charge see fit. And the people in charge are Jews and white people vying for power. and it sort of plays out in the left-right paradigm. So there is a genuine argument between the left and right over which types of people they think should be allowed to live. Some people on the right would want to euthanize and exterminate gays as well. Some people on the left, want to get rid of Christian fundamentalists. So anyway, there's a lot of compromises, but there's a lot of eugenics going on this whole time. Okay, so let me go ahead to the 1921 euthanization of the mentally ill. I've gone over a lot of this stuff in past videos, but I will put it all together for you.
To the wall, and the New York Times reported on it in this way. Here's the purpose of here's what the law was do. Here's what the New York said. Connecticut legislators are contemplating passing a law, quote, that would provide that persons found to be hopelessly insane after observation and examination of experts should be put to death as mercifully as possible, perhaps by poison. You can read the headline. They talk about the legislators seeing this man who's presented them, and the headline is exhibited as case for merciful extinction. All I'm saying is this is in a paper as if this is something to be discussed. Now, after this, remember what's happening at this time, okay? This is the time that the American Eugenics Society is trying to educate people that certain people are social cancers, etc. And now we get discussion of human beings with language over the next 15 years by eugenicists that is just astonishing. Here's how you'll see the unfit referred to in various eugenic publications. You can hear them described as social wastage, malignant biological growths, poisonous slime. Those are some of the terms given. Then in the 1930s, Harvard's Ernest Houghton, I think he's a professor of anthropology, writes, the unfit, quote, are specimens of humanity who really ought to be exterminated. This is a Harvard professor. Finally, in 1935, Alexis Carrel, he's a Nobel Prize-winning physician at Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research on the east side here. He writes a book that is reviewed by the New York Times and other mainstream publications called Man the Unknown. And he writes this: gigantic sums are now required to maintain prisons and insane asylums and protect the public against gangsters and lunatics. Why do we preserve these useless and harmful beings? The abnormal prevent the development of the normal. This fact must be squarely faced. Why should society not dispose of the criminals and insane in a more economical manner? He goes on and he says, at least any insane person who commits a crime, he concludes, should be humanely and economically disposed of in small euthanasic institutions supplied with proper gases.
Supplied with proper gases. Supplied with proper gases. And it's very interesting how he brought up that they were lunatics and that they wanted to get rid of gangsters and anyone who was deemed as mentally ill, who commits crimes and participated or partakes in gangsterism, needs to be exposed of, not shot, but euthanized using appropriate gases. And I wonder what kind of covert appropriate gases would be used in this day and age. Isn't it sad that you have the victim of eugenics who is the superior being to those who are doing eugenics to him, who has superior reasoning, who is much better for society than the people who are doing it to him, telling you what's going on as they are doing eugenics on him. And you have complete sellouts with inferior philosophy, spiritual bottom feeders especially, in the comments and other places, trying to play him out. Isn't that just horrible? I know I speak about myself here, but it has to be said by someone. And not many people have the balls, So we're going to get rid of the people who are honorable enough to sacrifice themselves to face the enemies of all humanity. They need to be disposed of. I need to be disposed of, not Bush and them, not DuPont, not Carnegie, not Davenport, but me, not the Sangers of the world, but me.
This law was formulated only after careful study of the California experiments.
So they came up with some more eugenics laws that only came up after the California experiment. So where was I? Where do I live again? Oh yes, I live in California. That's right. Interesting how that works. Do you think they haven't done it before? Don't be surprised when the eugenicists who do what they do, and then their family follows in their footsteps, tradition, ritual, what have you. Make one want to execute them. A completely sane man want to execute them. And the knowledge of the verifiable eugenics program that is being executed every single moment of every day in the world by the most out of touch and what we subjectively and perhaps objectively, look at as crazy people, makes you want to go even further than that. Now, let me play you some clips that are going to really strike home. You're going to really be forced to really think about things and really ask yourself, am I wrong? First of all, to flat out say that white people are inferior. They would say it was hate speech and that I'm a racist. Now couple that with the idea that if there's something that is socially normative that is agreed upon by the masses when it comes to race, one of the main things, if anything you could say, is that white people are crazy. How many times we say, oh, those crazy white people, they like to skydive, they like to do this crazy white person stuff, this rock and roll. They're crazy. Our stuff is cultural, their stuff is crazy. Okay? So the idea that the group of people, the race that we consider the craziest, is going to judge you and your behavior by itself is enough to...
Good working half time was 40%. The percentage on medication was 5%. Okay? And all his things, on all his different outcome measures, there's a lot of outcome measures. The off medication group does markedly better every single measurement. Okay? In his milder psychotic disorders group, it's the same thing. Okay? It's those who get off do much, much better. And the other thing here is this. So many of them are just not psychotic. Okay? The symptoms pass, they go back to work, etc. How many of you have heard of that study? Did you read about it in the New York Times? No. You read about it in any magazine? Okay, why not?
It's suppressed. To make a long story short, using intellectual jargon, white people and their Zionist allies are allowed to say that you're inferior and that the government should eradicate you. But if I was to... And if you do not come to the conclusion that I'm wrong, I want you to truly look inside your soul and ask yourself, well, why did it take a white person telling you these things before you believed them? When I have been saying this for years and years, especially you New World Order guys listening, you secret societies, you police officer guys, all the trolls that watch my videos, I want you to ask yourself, well, why did it take a white guy saying it for you to believe it? But when I say it, you say that I'm crazy and I'm paranoid. This first clip I'm going to play you is about children that are inferior. Now, I want you to notice that they're going to bring up physically inferior. So who's more physically superior than the top martial artists? When it comes to mind, what races are inferior? White people, even though they're the majority.
The purpose of this study, the reason you all funded it as American taxpayers, was to see what happened to people who went off their meds. So in this study, everybody was treated conventionally with drugs, okay? And then they're just followed for 15 years. And he ends up with 64 schizophrenia patients. 25 are off, and the remaining part remain on drugs, 39. Well, what does he report? He reports the outcomes, and it's a naturalistic study. Everybody treated with drugs, and then he just follows them. People are free to go off, etc. And basically, as I said, 25 to 64 go off, and he follows them at 2, 4.5, 7.5, 10, and 15 years. What does he find? First of all, he finds that of those off medication, more than half work. Okay? More than half, well, 40% of them become asymptomatic. They end up recovered, working, etc. The percentage that, so the recovery rate for those off medication and recovery